British paratroopers were dropping from the skies over Egypt. French bombers streaked across the desert horizon, and Israeli tanks were pushing deep into the Sinai Peninsula. For a moment, it seemed as if the old colonial order was reasserting itself, that the great empires of Europe were demonstrating their power, just as they had for centuries. But this was an illusion. What looked like a return to the past was, in fact, the violent, definitive end of an era. This was not the restoration of an empire. This was its funeral. Because the fate of this conflict, the future of the Middle East, and the very hierarchy of global power wouldn't be decided by tanks or by soldiers or by bombs. It would be decided by something far quieter and infinitely more potent. It was decided by a financial weapon meticulously developed in the halls of American power and deployed with surgical precision from Washington, D.C. This crisis marks the exact moment the torch of global leadership was passed, not in a ceremony, but in an act of economic coercion that brought a proud empire to its knees. How could dollars on a ledger defeat a victorious army? And what did the shift mean for the world that came after? To understand how this happened, we're going to examine this story in 5 critical chapters. First, we'll look at the canal itself, an empire's fragile lifeline. Then, the act of defiance that triggered the crisis. We'll uncover the secret plot for war, expose the mechanics of America's devastating financial weapon, and finally, witness the dawn of a new world order, one shaped in the crucible of this conflict. To truly grasp the Suez Crisis, you have to place yourself in the mindset of 1950s Britain. The nation had been bled dry by the Second World War. Its economy was fragile, its debts were enormous, but its political class, and particularly its Prime Minister Anthony Eden, still viewed the country through the lens of empire. They saw Britain as a top-tier global power, and the ultimate symbol of that power, the very artery of its imperial prestige, was a 105-mile man-made waterway cutting through the Egyptian desert, the Suez Canal. But the canal was so much more than a symbol. It was the jugular vein of the European economy. As you can see here, over half of all the oil fueling the reconstruction of Western Europe passed through this single, narrow choke point. For the factories of Britain, the power plants of France, and the burgeoning industries of a recovering continent, this wasn't just a convenient shipping lane. It was a non-negotiable lifeline. Its closure meant economic catastrophe. And this number reveals just how precarious Britain's situation was. Government planners had calculated that if the canal were to be shut down, the United Kingdom had only 6 weeks of oil reserves left. 6 weeks. After that, the lights would begin to dim, the factories would fall silent, and the entire British economy would seize up. The psychological pressure of this vulnerability was immense. Control over the Suez Canal was not a matter of foreign policy preference, it was perceived as a matter of national survival. And the man who would exploit this vulnerability to its fullest was Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader of Egypt. Nasser was a powerful, charismatic figure who championed a new wave of Arab nationalism. In his eyes, the Suez Canal, a waterway on Egyptian land owned and operated by a private company controlled by British and French shareholders, was a festering wound. It was a daily, humiliating reminder of colonial subjugation, and he was determined to excise it. Nasser got his chance through a stunning diplomatic miscalculation by the West. The United States and Britain had promised to help finance his signature project, the Aswan High Dam, a monumental undertaking meant to modernize Egypt. But as Nasser strengthened his ties with the Soviet bloc, Washington and London grew wary. They abruptly and very publicly withdrew their offer of funding. The move was intended to chasten Nasser. Instead, it humiliated him, backing him into a corner and giving him the perfect political pretext for the audacious act he had been planning all along. On July 26, 1956, Nasser stood before a massive crowd in Alexandria and delivered a fiery, hours-long speech broadcast across the Arab world. Deep into his address, he spoke the name of the canal's 19th century French builder, Ferdinand de Lesseps. It sounded like a historical reference. It was not. It was a prearranged code word. At that exact moment, Egyptian commandos stormed the offices of the Suez Canal Company, seizing its assets and asserting full Egyptian control. In a single stroke, the canal belonged to Egypt. For Britain and France, it was an act of theft. Their worst-case scenario had just become a reality. The reaction in London and Paris was immediate fury. But they faced a formidable obstacle: the American president, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was adamant that a military response was out of the question. He feared it would drive the entire Arab world into the arms of the Soviet Union, potentially triggering a much wider conflict. Blocked by their most powerful ally, Britain and France resorted to subterfuge. They began to conspire in the shadows, bringing in a third partner who had its own pressing reasons to confront Nasser, the State of Israel. In a secluded villa in Sèvres outside Paris, representatives of the three nations met in absolute secrecy. There, they drafted a document known as the Protocol of Sèvres. It was a cold, four-step blueprint for a manufactured war. First, Israel would launch a full-scale invasion of Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Then, Britain and France would play the part of concerned peacekeepers, issuing an ultimatum demanding that both Israeli and Egyptian forces withdraw from the Canal Zone. The demand on Egypt would be impossible for any sovereign nation to accept, to retreat from its own territory. When Nasser inevitably and justifiably refused, Britain and France would have their casus belli, their reason to invade, ostensibly to separate the combatants, but with the real goal of seizing the canal. It was a masterclass in geopolitical deception. Each of the three co-conspirators came to the table with a distinct motive. For Israel, the goal was to shatter the Egyptian military blockade of its southern ports and neutralize Nasser, its most dangerous adversary. For France, the primary objective was to cut off Nasser's support for rebels fighting for independence in its colony of Algeria. And for Britain, it was about everything: reclaiming the canal, securing the flow of oil, toppling a defiant Arab leader, and most of all, proving to the world, and to itself, that the British lions still had teeth. The secret plan was set in motion on October 29th. Just as planned, Israeli forces surged into the Sinai. The Anglo-French ultimatum was issued and rejected, and then their invasion began. From a purely military perspective, it was a resounding success. Egyptian forces were quickly overwhelmed. The invaders were achieving their objectives. It seemed as though their gamble had paid off. But while they were winning battles in the desert, they were unknowingly losing a far more important war, one being fought on the trading floors of New York and in the corridors of power in Washington. The global political backlash was swift and brutal. The United Nations General Assembly overwhelmingly condemned the invasion. The Soviet Union, sensing an opportunity, rattled its sabers, threatening to rain down nuclear missiles on London and Paris. The NATO alliance, the bedrock of Western security, was fractured, with the US on one side and its two oldest allies on the other. And in the White House, President Eisenhower was seething. He felt personally betrayed. His allies had lied to him, launched a colonial-era war in the middle of the Cold War, and risked igniting a global confrontation. He was determined to end it. And this is where the real weapon was unsheathed. Global financial markets, governed by confidence, went into a state of panic. International investors saw Britain, a nation already in a weak economic position, defying the United States and jeopardizing global oil supplies. They began to sell off their holdings of the British currency, the pound sterling, as fast as they could. This triggered what is known as a run on the pound. To stop its value from collapsing entirely, the Bank of England was forced to buy up pounds on the open market, using its precious reserves of US dollars to do so. The nation's financial lifeblood began to drain away at an astonishing rate. The scale of the financial bleeding was catastrophic. At the height of the crisis, Britain was losing tens of millions of dollars from its reserves every single day. The total loss would amount to over $655 million, more than 20% of the country's entire foreign reserve stockpile. Britain was hemorrhaging money at a pace that was simply unsustainable. The economic foundations of the state were beginning to crumble, even as its army advanced on the battlefield. This is when America made its move. Prime Minister Eden, desperate to stop the run on the pound, appealed to the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, for an emergency loan. But the IMF was, and is, largely controlled by the United States. Washington quietly blocked the request. Then the U.S. Treasury Secretary delivered the killing blow. He informed his British counterpart that the United States was preparing to begin selling off its massive holdings of British government bonds. Had this threat been carried out, it would have created a tidal wave of selling that would have rendered the pound worthless, triggering a complete economic collapse. The message was unmistakable, and it was brutal. This was not a negotiation. It was a financial ultimatum. End your invasion, or we will bankrupt you. The mechanics of this financial power are a crucial element of modern geopolitics. If you find this analysis of grand strategy valuable, consider supporting our work by liking this video and subscribing for future deep dives. Your engagement helps us continue to explore these pivotal moments in history. For Anthony Eden, there was no choice left to make. Checkmated by his own ally, facing the prospect of financial Armageddon, he folded. On November 6th, to the astonishment of the world and the disgust of his French and Israeli partners, he announced an immediate ceasefire. The invasion ground to a halt. Soon after, British and French troops began a deeply humiliating withdrawal. A military victory had been transformed into a total and absolute political defeat. The fallout from this moment redrew the map of global power. The contrast between the before and after is stark. Before Suez, Britain could still act as an independent imperial power, a primary actor in the Middle East, capable of unilateral military intervention. After Suez, that was over. The United States was now the dominant Western actor in the region. It was no longer just the leader of the Western alliance, it was its financial guarantor, the power that could enable, or as Britain learned, disable, the actions of its allies. The era of independent European empires was finished. The lesson was delivered in the most public and painful way imaginable. The Suez Crisis proved, for all the world to see, that Great Britain no longer possessed the economic strength to project military power against the wishes of the United States. It could act as a junior partner, but not as an independent great power. The illusion of its top-tier status was shattered. For Britain, this was the moment it was forced to accept its new role in the world. America did not hesitate to fill the power vacuum that Britain and France left behind. Just 2 months after the ceasefire, in January 1957, President Eisenhower went before Congress to announce what became known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. This policy formally declared the Middle East to be a region of vital national interest to the United States. It was a clear signal to the Soviet Union and to the world that America was now the primary guardian of Western interests in the most oil-rich region on the planet. And the doctrine was immediately put into practice. It wasn't just rhetoric, it was policy backed by money and military might. Millions of dollars in economic and military aid began to flow to key regional allies like Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, shoring them up against Soviet influence. And just a year later, in 1958, when a crisis erupted in Lebanon, it was American troops who landed on the beaches of Beirut. The guard had officially and visibly changed. So what is the ultimate lesson of Suez? It is a profound insight into the nature of modern power. It demonstrated that in the post-war world, defined by the Bretton Woods financial system, power was not just measured in armies and navies, it was measured in currency reserves and control over international financial institutions. The crisis proved that economic leverage, when wielded ruthlessly, could be a weapon more decisive than any bomb. The Suez Crisis was the moment America took possession of the West's most powerful non-military weapon. The events of that autumn defined the world for the next half-century, and it leaves us with a critical question for our own era. As the global balance of economic power continues to shift, who will wield that weapon next?